and I'm going to briefly introduce everybody in the order that they'll be speaking. And what I'm hoping is to get a sort of dynamic conversation, which is difficult among disciplines and among different religious perspectives, and hoping that these are going to congeal together to form an impactful whole. So the first person that we have is Dr. Ulla Berg. She's Associate Professor of Anthropology and Chair of Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers University. Her research examines migration, mobility, and border and detention systems in the Americas. She has also led major studies on immigrant detention in New Jersey and on how Andean migrants experience the global deportation regime. She serves on the boards of First Friends of New Jersey and New York and Envision Freedom. Next, we have Kyle Elizabeth Barron, clinical teaching fellow and supervising attorney at the Immigrant Rights Clinic at NYU Law School. Her work focuses on challenging immigration detention and deportation in federal courts. Before law school, she helped lead the accompaniment program at New Sanctuary Coalition and co-founded a pro se asylum clinic, partnering closely with faith communities that, to support non-citizens. Michelle Dibblee, our third panelist, is the Missioner for Equity and Justice with the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. She supports more than 80 congregations and collaborates with community partners on social, economic, and racial justice. She also coordinates the DMV accompaniment network, accompanying migrants to ICE check-ins and immigrant court, drawing on more than 2 decades in community organizing and movement work. And finally, we're joined by Ruth Messinger, former president and now global ambassador of American Jewish World Service. A lifelong public servant, including service in the New York City Council and as Manhattan Borough President, she continues to champion global justice and support immigrants and asylum seekers in New York. She also serves on the boards of Aegis Trust and the Interfaith Center of New York. And she says that she's always worked for justice, loves politics, and teaches leadership at JTS. Thanks. Thanks for welcoming all these accomplished panelists. See if it just, you could check. Yeah.
So good morning, everyone. I want to thank Tamara Neuman, Rabbi Tucker, and JTS for the invitation, and also everyone for what promises to be an important conversation here today. So as we just heard from Senator Jeff Koons, these are indeed unprecedented times, for sure. Not one day goes by where we do not witness masked, unidentified agents roaming our streets, courthouses, schools, daycares, and hospitals, making communities unsafe, terrorizing our neighbors, and separating families, all part of a step up in the government's frontal assault on non-citizens driven by cruelty, profit, and white supremacist ideological goals of fundamentally redefining who can belong in the United States of America. The daily assaults that we witness today on persons, institutions, and democracy itself are deep and wide-ranging, with consequences for people not just in the United States, but across the hemisphere and across the globe. In the subsequent days, weeks, and months after Trump's return to power in January 25, the administration pulled back from international humanitarian efforts funded by the US aid and destroyed a vast ecosystem of nonprofit organizations across the Americas attending to migrants and refugees in transit to safety. It bared protections for migrants, including putting an effective end to asylum and indefinitely suspending the US refugee admissions program for all except white South Africans. It disregarded the constitutional right to due process as outlined in the Fifth Amendment by evoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, sent people to overseas prisons and detention camps, lacking safety and accountability. It revoked temporary protected status and other legal statuses granted by humanitarian parole programs, leaving hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees in legal limbo. It used arbitrary detention and deportation as a tool against speech, channeled roughly $170 billion to immigration enforcement, making ICE the largest federal enforcement agencies in US history, and forged a racist ideological campaign to end birthright citizenship. The list is long and ongoing. All of these efforts, barely disguised as great replacement conspiracy theory with its paranoid narratives of white extinctions, are carried out while pitching at every opportunity law-abiding American citizens against the quintessential figure of the criminal alien, quote unquote, which now has come to mean not just every Black and brown non-citizen, regardless of past criminal record and time served, but many citizens of all backgrounds as well. So how did we get here? We're often very quick to blame the Trump administration, and often for good and obvious reasons. But we must also not forget the broader history and political economic context that have led to this historic role and buy-in by Democrats and from the Clinton to the Obama and Biden administration, and by private companies in creating the groundwork for the enforcement system that Trump has since unleashed on steroids. In my brief remarks today, I therefore want to highlight these historical continuities in immigration policies, emphasizing bipartisan complicity and the economic infrastructure that sustains detention and deportation as we see it today. Today's deportation policy, with its related billion-dollar detention industry, is rooted in a long history of policy choices made across political lines, a continuity that should challenge the tendency to treat current events as entirely novel. Undeniably, a presentist orientation towards the Trump 2.0's mediated spectacles of abductions and mass deportation cover up at least two important facts. The first is that the US state has always racialized, excluded, and brutalized the poor. The first Trump administration's family separation policy in 2018, which outraged many Americans, imitated strategies used by the US government agencies over the course of many decades to criminalize and punish poor, Black, Latinx, and Native communities, funneling children into foster care for petty or imagined crimes. Indeed, the government practice of taking children is, according to historian Laura Briggs, as American as the apple pie. The separation of children from their asylum-seeking parents achieved support from certain sectors of the US public precisely because the policy invoked well-known images of irresponsible, neglectful Black, Latinx, and Native parents from earlier eras. Such criminalizing language and imagery has repeatedly allowed the state to convince the public that the practice was necessary and perhaps even justified. The second fact that presentism obscures is that the modern US deportation regime, with its roots in 19th century Chinese exclusion laws and mass deportations of Mexicans in the first half of the 20th century, became firmly entrenched in the mid-1990s as a result of legal changes that made broader swaths of non-citizens detainable and deportable. This includes mandatory detention legislation, the delegalization of lawful permanent residence in the late 1990s, and post-9/11 enforcement. The most significant legal changes leading to the expansion of immigration detention in the US came in 1996 with the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, passed and enacted during the Clinton administration. These laws expanded the list of misdemeanor and crimes making someone subject to mandatory detention and deportation. The 1996 laws also targeted certain asylum seekers as subjects to potential removal, artificially creating the need for more detention space, while revoking the discretion of immigration authorities to release non-citizens from detention. Then came 9/11, the restrictive measures taken on immigration in the aftermath of 9/11 attacks contributed greatly to filling up empty prison beds with immigration detainees, leading many critics to suggest that the prison industrial complex had been transformed into an immigration industrial complex, and in part saving a private prison industry that had expanded during the war on drugs, but now had remained partially empty as fewer states signed new contracts to incarcerate citizens. In this way, immigration detention became both a preferred federal policy and an important market and means of profiteering, even bringing local communities into the orbit of immigration enforcement. And I want to conclude with one brief and recent example that illustrates this tension. So in March 2025, the Union County Board of Commissioners, right across the water in New Jersey, voted 6-3 to solicit bids to sell off parts of a vacant jail complex, which had been closed down in 2021 as a cost-saving measure after New Jersey's jails had started to empty out with the state's historic bail reform in 2017. Justifications for the 2025 RFP process made by several commissioners was that tearing down the jail would be extremely costly, remodeling it and converting it into office or recreational spaces even more so, but that selling parts of it and keeping it as a jail would be the most cost-effective, requiring the least amount of investment by the county. This example shows how local communities become dependent in a kind of locked-in system. Once a community or county is financially tied to detention, there's strong pressure to keep it going or even expanding it, making it clear that profit motives are endemic and a central part of the problem. Increasingly, over the past decade, local county jails across the country regularly rent out bed space to ICE, using the revenue to close their budgets, and sometimes even to fund schools, parks, and other public goods. A recent book by colleagues Nancy Hemster and Deirdre Conlon also document what many organizations and lawyers know from experience, namely that cost containment within detention centers furthermore lead to atrocious conditions for those detained. Poor quality food, poor quality or lacking medical care, sky-high commissary prices, and labor exploitation, where detainees work for $1 a day cleaning and cooking, saving private prison companies millions of dollars in labor costs. This must serve as proof that the swelling of the immigration system, which is currently at over 60,000 a day, although the numbers are a little bit hard to obtain, and that this is intimately linked to the endemic profit motives of carceral capitalism. Reducing or removing profit incentives is therefore a key lever to begin to dismantle this unjust system. In the meantime, as members of local communities, we need all hands on deck to witness, protest, litigate, legislate, resist, and refuse while we together chart a future free of caging and digital enclosures and with dignity for all. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Kyle Elizabeth Baron.
Baron, actually. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. So I have been practicing in federal court for the last about 5 or 6 years, and before that I did a lot of immigration organizing. So like Professor Berg talked about, there's a lot of kind of continuity in what's happening, but I'll talk a little bit about, through a legal lens, some of the continuity, but also some of the differences we've been seeing with this Trump administration. And as discussed, there have been obviously some terrible laws on the books, and I think for in 1996 was a major important set of laws were enacted by Congress that really fused sort of the criminal justice system with the immigration system, and that's had huge repercussions. And then post 9/11, there were also a lot of immigration laws that were passed. And while these were terrible and on the books, and in some ways were exercised, particularly against Muslim communities after 9/11, they've been sort of lying dormant in a lot of ways and haven't been fully exercised. And I think Congress really hasn't had to live with the full repercussions of what they put in the books. And so I think for the first time, many of these laws, where I remember reading about them in immigration, in like my immigration class in law school, just saying like, is anyone actually ever going to fully execute these laws, because they're just sort of unbelievable that they're even in the books. And so we do see for the first time some laws being executed to their fullest extent. So one is particularly for people who are under expedited removal, who arrive to the border, and they're just not even allowed to see a judge, and they can just be summarily removed, no matter, with like very, very little due process. And so that law was kind of blunted over the years by either prosecutorial discretion, where a president could just say, you know, like, we'll only execute that or enforce that in certain contexts. And they could also blunt those through regulations, and so they never really it was never really executed fully. But the Trump administration, in the first Trump administration, but now is executing these fully, where they can, both temporally and geographically, can be enforced. They're enforcing them throughout the entire United States. And it seems, I think a lot of people who might not know that that was the law, it seems incredible that this could be executed. Somebody that's been living in the United States for 2 years, living, you know, in Kansas or something, can be expedited removal as if they're just arriving at the border, and treated as if they're standing outside the gates of the United States and don't get to see an immigration judge, and just can be essentially summarily removed. So that's one aspect, is just the Trump administration's willingness to enforce the laws that are already on the books. And then a second aspect has been the Trump administration and the agencies under him sort of interpreting laws that have been on the books for a long time, but interpreting them in novel ways. And so in some contexts, one of them is for people who have been living in the United States for any time, sometimes decades, 50 years, are suddenly not allowed, if they're arrested, to have a bond hearing in front of an immigration judge. So generally, when many people had been arrested by ICE, maybe they were subject to deportation proceedings, they could at least ask an immigration judge for release, and they could see, okay, you're not a danger, you're not a flight risk, you can return to your family and can go through the court and removal process outside of detention. But suddenly overnight, the Trump administration began interpreting these laws to say, nope, everybody is subject to mandatory detention, and overnight, millions of people were no longer allowed to have even a bond hearing. And so you have seen, at least in some ways, a lot of the federal courts have been rejecting these interpretations, but it's necessary to, on a case-by-case basis, go through a federal court, ask them to kind of look at the case, and it can be very, very, very time-intensive, and something that just a lot of immigration attorneys aren't able to do. And that's not even mentioning all the people who don't have immigration attorneys and just don't have the ability to ask a federal court judge for release when it really should be the immigration judge that has been doing it for decades upon decades. So in those two ways, that's just been a huge expansion of detention and removal, just in one, executing and enforcing immigration laws to their fullest extent, and then in another way, just interpreting the existing laws in a new way. I'd say a third aspect that has been, at least for me, who hasn't been practicing for very long, but it has been kind of witnessing what's been going on with the immigration system for a few decades, is sort of the cruelty and some things that a lot of lawyers haven't even been prepared to face because it's just kind of unbelievable. So in March of 2025, in the same week, I had actually rented a cello because I thought I was going to learn the cello, but I have not picked it up because it was the same week that the Trump administration really started sort of these new tactics that were kind of beyond the pale in some ways. So one was the ideological targeting of students. So, students getting picked up on the street by masked, ununiformed agents, for writing an op-ed, things like that. That was one of the things in one of the first weeks in March. And then also, as Professor Berg mentioned, the Alien Enemies Act was invoked for the first time. And I think what the Trump administration has been doing in many of these kind of efforts, they'll announce what they're going to do, and it just seems a little bit outrageous that some people kind of don't believe it's true, but have been preparing. And so the ACLU had heard the Trump administration talk about invoking the Alien Enemies Act, which was a law that should generally be used in wartime in times of insurrection or an incursion, and would allow the government to just summarily remove people who were at war with, essentially. And the Trump administration invoked this against Venezuelans, and so when the ACLU was challenging this and other advocates, they first took sort of like a statutory argument, like, is this an incursion? Is this an invasion? We're not at war, this shouldn't apply. And then also a due process issue, like, can people even contest that they are, part of this group that should be targeted under this law? And what the Trump administration was doing under the Alien Enemies Act was attempting to, and they did, remove people from Venezuela to El Salvador and to CICOT, and you probably read about it in the news, but essentially into a high security prison, which many people, I think it's just very clear that they essentially torture people there. They would shave people's heads when they went in. They were put into like very, very tiny bunks in these cells. And so some of it was just kind of such a surprise and kind of a break with what a lot of administrations did before that, no amount of notice should justify sending someone to a prison in a country they've never been to before. And so I think the kind of legal community has had to rethink the way that we're framing things and having to take a much more sort of, I guess, like a more bold approach, where a lot of times we would just ask for little incremental things, but just saying like the whole system and the whole approach to this is just unlawful, is against substantive due process in a way that is not just challenging the way they're doing it, but the whole fact that it's being done. And just representing people in that situation, being put on a plane and not knowing what's going to happen, and only being, some people were pulled off the plane just because they happened to be a named plaintiff in one case, but many, many other people were sent to CICOT and imprisoned for many months. And so I think with that as well, one of the big changes that we've seen is the way that the Justice Department itself and the attorneys that are representing the government have been willing to sort of break the law themselves. And it's been pretty clear that often, there's been leaks that show that they knew something they were presenting to the judge was untrue. They would try to kind of mess with the timing of how certain things were put in front of the court to be able to effectuate what they have to know was a very unlawful effort by the Trump administration. And so for the whole time I've practiced, you're often, if you're up against the federal government, they get what's called a presumption of regularity, where kind of whatever they say goes, and the judge will just accept it as the truth. And you have to, you have to go above and beyond to challenge anything in any representation the government says, because they have a presumption of regularity. And so now, the first time in my practice, many judges are starting to not automatically give that to the government, and are willing to, ask for a little bit more evidence, look behind the statements and the claims that the government is making. And so I think it's going to be interesting when we look back and see the record of what is happening and the changes in the country and which direction we're going, and how a lot of this is sort of encapsulated in a lot of these judicial decisions that are happening right now. Because judges are in dialogue with the administration in a lot of ways that's incredible every time I read it. They'll just speak to the administration and say, like, okay, you're making this argument that you can arrest this person with no process. You won't let them even go to a judge and contest that that their detention is unlawful, which is the argument that the government makes in a lot of cases. They'll say, if you can do this here, what is to say you can't do this to a U.S. citizen? And at what point are they going to be able to contest the legality of their detention? And could you do this to a sitting judge? With the arguments that the government's making and the mistakes we've already seen them made, deporting Kilmer Abrego, Garcia, and even before the Trump administration, ICE makes a lot of mistakes. And so the arguments that you're not even able to contest that in front of a judge are now being rejected by a lot of courts. And so there have been some pretty major changes. I think there's a long way to go, but one thing I also want to emphasize is that many of the more bold moves by federal courts in the immigration context are still so piecemeal and often on a case-by-case basis. And so one major, message would be that the courts won't save us. And so I think there is an aspect to the litigation and supporting efforts like from the ACLU and other legal services organizations, but also I think nothing can really change without being hand in hand with the protests, people out in the streets, people raising their voices. And it's been really heartening to me because sometimes I feel like, as an immigration advocate, sort of yelling into the wind, and a lot of people just don't seem to really know that the stakes, what is at stake. But I think looking at what's happening on the streets of Chicago and people really standing up to ICE in their streets and protecting their neighbors is just as important to these legal battles. So thank you.
Great, thanks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Tamara, and to JTS for the invitation to be with you today. I want to start by telling you all about Padre Vidal, who is the priest at San Mateo, which is a congregation just outside of Washington, D.C. It's the largest Spanish-speaking congregation among our 80 congregations. We have a few, but this is the largest. And Vidal is one of those people who is, I think people who know him would describe him as a force of nature. He's about my height. He's not big, but he is the person who has almost single-handedly engaged the community of worshipers around him at San Mateo. There are 4 services there every Sunday, which is significantly more than most of our Episcopal churches. And it's by and large a Spanish-speaking congregation that is mostly an immigrant congregation from Latin America, from all across the diaspora. He himself is from El Salvador and has family ties there. He's generosity embodied, as is San Mateo, and they have for years had food distribution out of their parking lot, not only for families in the neighborhood, but also they are the hub distribution for about 6 to 10 organizations that would come and pick up food, take it to their organizations, and pass it out. They have health clinics twice a month. They have, you go to anything at San Mateo, and the first thing that Vidal or somebody else says is, sit down and have something to eat, right? This is this congregation. Everybody knows Vidal. But now, San Mateo locks their doors for worship. They locked their doors. They started preparing 6 months ago for what might happen if immigration enforcement came knocking, which they haven't yet, but they still lock their doors and have citizen protectors who are citizens, who are not at risk for deportation, standing outside and watching the streets so that they can tell the congregation if ICE is in the neighborhood. They have canceled the food distribution that happens at their site and moved it to another congregation that is less at risk because it is not an immigrant congregation. There are multiple leaders in this congregation, including all of the musicians, who are either in the process of self-deporting or have already done so. So I want to bring Vidal and San Mateo into this space because I don't feel like I can have this conversation about what faith communities can do without the particularity of a person, of a congregation, of what's happening not just to San Mateo, but to congregations everywhere. There's another congregation in DC that canceled worship because ICE was staging out of a parking lot. Just for one Sunday, but can you imagine having to cancel worship because of that? There are 2 other places I know of where people who were in line for food distribution or leaving were picked up by ICE and immigration enforcement in DC. So that's the reality that has been described here, and I think that I want to say 2 more things about that. One is, individual families are being separated, congregations are being broken apart. The fabric of these communities, of our communities, is being destroyed because of the fear that is being brought to bear and the persecution that's happening. So I want to say that not inconsequentially, this is what white Christian nationalism wants. Mm-hmm. To name that I sit here as someone who is part of a Christian church who absolutely denounces what is happening in other parts of our community that are probably the loudest voices interpreting Christianity to the U.S. today, and to say that that is not the Christianity that so many of us sit with. But it feels really important to name that that is a voice and a practice that is happening, and to push against that. Even if just by saying that in this moment, I want to make sure that that comes into the room as well. So in the face of all of this pushback, I want to talk a little bit about how our faith communities are pushing back. And I learned something recently from Marty Dickinson, who's one of the members of the National Cathedral Sanctuary Ministry. We're talking about welcoming the stranger, and Marty said to me, I hate that language. And I thought, okay, so what do you hate about the notion that we want to welcome someone? And he said, I hate the fact that it presumes that someone is a stranger. I hate that it presumes that someone is not already here, that is not family, as was said earlier today, that is not neighbor. And that sent me into thinking about a text that I just want to talk as one example of the ways that our Christian communities, but I think all of our religious communities, as evidenced by the first panel we have today, are thinking about human dignity and connection. And this is the story of the Good Samaritan, which is a little tricky to tell in a Jewish community because it is one of the stories that has been used to denigrate members of Jewish leadership. So I want to say from the very beginning of using this story is that Jesus was a Jew talking to other Jews, and this is an intra-family conversation, right? For those of you who don't know the story, Jesus was asked by someone who his neighbor was in an effort to live up to what his God was asking him to do. And so Jesus tells a story about a man who was robbed on a dangerous road and left to die, and was passed by 2 exemplary religious leaders who excused themselves from helping for various reasons. And this man was helped by a Samaritan, which is where we get the story about the Good Samaritan, who was anathema to the Jewish community of the time. And this is the person who stopped, who put this man on, he dressed this man's wounds, put him on his own horse and took him to an inn and left money for the innkeepers to care for this person. This is the man who would have been, had someone asked, of the 3 people who were presented in the story, this is the man who the listener would have said he would never have done that. And so at the end of the story, Jesus asks the person who said the question, who is this person's neighbor? And the answer was the one who showed him mercy. And this story feels to me real in this space, in this time, because I think what Jesus was saying is that we are the ones who have created the rules about who belongs and who doesn't, and who deserves mercy and who doesn't. God didn't create any of those rules. All of our traditions have threads of the rule making that does not actually, I don't think, rise to what our traditions would ask of us in terms of love and mercy and crossing boundaries and recognition. So God's desire for us is to be neighbors, is to show mercy, and to respond to the wounded and the vulnerable and the needy without rules. That is sometimes, and God's desires also for people not to be attacked and left to die on the side of the road, right? So I'm going to get to that in a second too. But we are in a position as faith communities where we need to live up to the best of what we are called to do, which means taking risks and crossing boundaries and doing more than sometimes we have done. So I think what that means is that we need to live into something that the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas calls the moral imaginary, which is more than imagination. A moral imaginary is that which sets out in front of us in as embodied a way as possible what a moral world might look like. I'm going to read to you from what she writes, because I think it's always lovely when someone says something better than you could say it yourself. So I'm going to bring you her words. To counter our fraught moral present, we need to cultivate a collective moral imaginary, the capacity to see beyond what is and aspire toward what could be. It means planting seeds of justice and truth in the stories we live and tell our children, as well as in public life. These are not naive gestures to get us through a despairing present. Rather, they are the foundations for a moral and just future. Faith and religious communities bear a unique responsibility in this work. They are rooted in teachings of justice, compassion, and human dignity, and they must stand unwavering in the aspiration of what could be. Their task is nothing less to inspire courage, foster hope, and mobilize collective action toward a world that reflects our highest moral ideals without moral compromise. So that's what we are called to. I'm going to talk later today in a workshop with my friend Benz about the work of accompaniment and the work of public resistance. I believe my colleague Ruth Messinger is also going to talk about the role of faith communities. So I will stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I have a temptation, which I'm not going to indulge because then I wouldn't be able to speak, but my temptation was to ask the 3 people who spoke before me eloquently if they each spoke again with lists of things that had happened, and if I required you to say at the end of every sentence, with my tax money. Because that's the way we're not thinking about this, and that's a piece of the problem. So first of all, I want to thank JTS and Rabbi Tucker particularly for this conference, but it's properly named because we look for a dignified name, and upholding human dignity is exactly the right dignified name. But when Rabbi Tucker and Tamara first called me, it was like, don't you think the faith groups in this city could get together to oppose cruelty? and that's at the core of what we're talking about, is fighting cruelty as US policy. You heard when it started, we've all seen it now, living on steroids, but at every level of government, off and on over at least the last couple of decades, but intensely in the last few years, there is a deliberate effort to demean, to denounce, to degrade the other, focused particularly, not exclusively, but particularly for our purposes today on the immigrant community, and then literally to detain and deport them. So, we live in a world in which we all have reason to say almost any day, like, I just didn't know. So let me just say that on this issue, thanks to some of the good efforts of many of the advocacy groups that I work with, this issue is actually known. And if you came here too quickly this morning, you missed the front page of the New York Times. But it says, pressure on ICE to deport leaves children without their parents. That is what is happening. There's a story in here of a woman who stands for thousands of people who was arrested at her work site, deported illegally, that is, she had standing to pursue her asylum claim, and she was deported, and she has two adult children here taking care of her youngest child, and she's trying to talk to him online. That's cruelty. And we had a dramatic example of it, whatever, years ago when we were separating people at the border. It's just more subtle now, but it's happening. If you go, and we hope you will, and we hope you will learn how to do accompaniment, if you go a whole distance from here, like a 15-minute subway ride, to 26 Federal Plaza or 290 Broadway, what you will see is people of all ages, immigrant status of different types, many of them without all of their papers. They've been summoned to a hearing. They go for a hearing. The federal judges, I want to say, who are carrying out the law are very gracious, and based on the hearings I've sat in on. They have amazing translation services. They try to help online. They try to help people, and in most instances, they are telling people, okay, here's the status of your application. You're going to need to come back for another hearing. The date will be in February or March. Half of those people, when they leave the courtroom, are surrounded by masked agents, says sometimes Border Patrol, sometimes ICE, sometimes something else. All of the people that I've seen on the days that I've been there wear masks and don't have name tags. So you don't know who's doing it, and you can't get them to tell you, and believe me, we've tried, who is on which list and when people get detained. But if they get detained, they are then separated from their families. They may end up being deported. This is a violation of every aspect of due process. You heard it from my colleagues. It's an assault on human beings, and it's cruel practice being carried out every day with my tax money and with yours. And that's the way in which we need to think about it. I think one of you mentioned Delaney, but not by name, but across the river in Newark is one of these detention centers. You really cannot imagine if you were going to write a bad play. First of all, it's a private prison, essentially run by a private corporation for the federal government. Second of all, the space they found to put it on, poor Newark, but it's a block of factories, and they're all toxic. So literally standing there to protest, you start wheezing, and I don't wheeze. It's really unpleasant, and we have people going there to visit, to find their families. This facility, with apparently the permission of your federal government and mine, and our tax dollars, changes the visiting hour rules, keeps people out, families who show up to visit are not allowed in. This is happening with our tax money. The guards at Delaney assaulted a congresswoman who went to visit. She's a congresswoman. She represents New Jersey. She represents all of us and our tax dollars. She wanted to see what was happening in her territory, and she was attacked by the guards. Just one more mention, because again, you heard examples of this, but I want to give these people names. Dylan Contreras is a young man who enrolled in Ellis, which I can't remember what it stands for now, but it's an alternative high school for immigrant kids. He was attending school. He was detained from school and deported. He's been in a facility in Pennsylvania for 5 months. It's very hard for us to find him, and when you find him, he gets moved. But that's where he is. His mother led the No Kings demonstration, but you don't hear all of these stories. This is happening to people who are following the law and trying to make their lives here as immigrants. We also live city, state, federal government in which this behavior is fueled by rhetoric from people who are supposed to be leading us. Okay, so I was actually at the meeting 3 years ago where the now still mayor of New York City said, in response to a question, and it was, I'm sorry, but it was clear that it was a setup. It was the first question he asked about a loss of city services. Somebody complained about something with their fire station, and he said, that's because the immigrants are destroying New York. Now, he was required to walk that back, so he walked it back 3 days later saying the immigrants are destroying the budget of New York, but that's not what he said, and it's not what he meant, and it's not what he felt. And I don't know if it's because, and I'm not just castigating him, I'm talking about lots of people, people that we know. I don't know how much of it is really a fear of the other, and how much of it is the need, particularly on people in my former political business who just love finding scapegoats. But the immigrants in this city and state have become scapegoats for whatever you want to say. And what's tragic about this, without going into detail because I don't have time, is you know, I'm talking about every single person in this auditorium, you know our history. Okay, Anne, stand up. When did your family come here? When and from where and why? Quickly. Well, everybody needs to answer that question for themselves. I will take a bet that 80% of the people in this room are second-generation Americans. If your grandparents came here as immigrants, which is true for most of you, you are a second-generation American. Some of us, not me, but some of us will be lucky enough to be alive when the second generation of the people who are coming in today are here. They are already on, we have immigrant families and first-generation Americans, thank God, on our city council, doing extraordinary efforts to bring all of this to light. What I want you to know, you can do it, we're at the seminary, you can do it from the Bible, you can do it from Torah, you can do it from your own family history. We are all immigrants. We are descended from immigrants, and our ancestors, in varying degrees, built this city and this country. We have a desperate need, please hear this next sentence, we have a desperate need for this immigrant labor in this city today, in construction, in food services, and in home health care. There are some extraordinary efforts to connect people who are here as immigrants up with training and employment, but we could be doing so much more in ways that would benefit all of us at every level. If we train and employ depending on how you'd like to count, 300 to 500,000 new New Yorkers who have come here since August of 2022, these are people who will, to be blunt, pay your Social Security, or they won't. They are desperate for jobs. There are jobs that they need. Yes, they need services. Yes, they need support, but talk about things to do. We will go and we will talk about it, but we need to go beyond knowing our own stories, which is critically important. We need to go to accepting responsibility. I've been motivated my entire political life by Rabbi Heschel, who said, in a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Very few people here wrote these policies, but it's our tax dollars and it's our responsibility. And we have much, much more that we ought to be doing. I was very moved by Senator Coons, who you saw, that I know, and I asked him when I was up on the stage whether he uses a line that I've been using in my speeches, so I will share it with you. There's a woman named Elizabeth Willing Powell who lived in Philadelphia. She was a Quaker, and when the Constitution was being written, she asked Ben Franklin, "So, Dr. Franklin, do we have a monarchy or a republic?" And Ben Franklin said, "Madam, we have a republic if you can keep it." And that is really the challenge for all of us now, is to take that responsibility, try to protect a democracy that is being attacked at every level in every possible way. But I would say for today and for this panel, to own our role as immigrants and the descendants of immigrants and people who have a religious, a moral, and an ethical responsibility to meet the needs of today's newest New Yorkers. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I guess if I had one comment or one thing that I wanted to remind people of, it's almost as if immigration policies and the cruelty therein is a testing ground for whittling away democratic rights within the broader society. So it's not just this one group of people targeted, it's one vulnerable group of people being targeted as kind of the showcase for what might be to come beyond this particular group. I wanted to ask, along those rights, maybe one question and then open it up for questions from the audience. How do you think immigration, and this is kind of, I'm asking some broader questions. How do you think immigration enforcement and policies intersect with racialization, ideas of whiteness, and culture, and broader culture wars in the US? And this is to any of our panelists.
Well, I mean, it goes to the observation, I guess, from Shai before, that we haven't finished fighting the Civil War. So, Ulla did this very clearly in her history. We've denigrated black and brown populations over and over and over again. And the fact that, not surprisingly, immigrants are coming here from countries where there are more black and brown people, and those who are coming, and they're coming from those countries, just to be clear, because they are particularly denied opportunity and particularly victims of oppression in those countries. And so they come here in the hope and the prayer that it will be different. And what we're saying is it's not nearly different enough. The immigrants that I was talking about particularly are from Central and South America. So just want to be clear. If you come from Venezuela, where we have a large number of immigrants, it means you walked across 6 countries. We all have stories about what our grandparents and our great-grandparents did. Quite commendable, quite extraordinary, but these are people who walked across 6 countries with buses, with people stealing their money and stealing their papers to get here. And then we have a huge group of immigrants coming from West Africa, which takes also extraordinary effort. They have to save money for plane fare, then they fly to Mexico, and then they come in through the border. There are amazing groups, I didn't get a chance to say this, but there are amazing groups, faith-based, houses of worship, secular community organizations in every part of this city who are welcoming people, who are doing unbelievable efforts to reach out, to provide help. There are mosques in the West Bronx that are storefront churches, essentially, storefront mosques, and they're sleeping people on the floor. We try not to identify where they are, so they won't be attacked. But those are all black Africans, Muslims. And so it's a continuation of the same othering, which we are told, I love welcoming the stranger, but we are told not to, we were these people. It's just that in the immigration story, folks, we really are these people.
Yeah, I agree. Part of taking back any advances that were achieved in the civil rights movement. Anybody else want to?
I just, to expound a little bit on the white Christian nationalism question, right? Like this is where the culture wars are happening, and it's the project of white Christian nationalism to create a country that is that puts some people at the top and everybody else at the bottom, or to deport and exclude people from our country overall, right? So I think that's there. It's racist and it's oppressive, and it is. It's targeting it targets LGBTQ people, right? So white Christian nationalism is part of the answer to the question about how immigration, deportation efforts are part of the culture wars. It's a very visible, painful, cruel expression of that particular expression of.
I guess just really quickly, on the legal, in the legal lens, I think we have, sometimes in the laws it's explicit, like the 96 laws we mentioned were sort of created a prison to deportation pipeline, and so where you have the same sort of racial injustice that's happening in the criminal system, where people who are black and brown are targeted through stop and frisk and sort of funneled into this criminal justice system. They're then put right into the deportation system, so that's in the laws. But then you also have what is supposed to be the backstop, which is the Constitution, which should say these things shouldn't be happening. A lot of those foundations were created in the laws that, or the the decisions that the Supreme Court is applying today come from like the Chinese Exclusion Act cases. So while Korematsu is supposedly, you know, not good law anymore, many other cases that, you know, aren't in the popular, like, vernacular are being quoted all the time by the government. And so we're having to talk about, do people in the United States have due process rights? And again, when I was in law school, that was something, of course they do, but no, they don't. And that's what the government will argue, that no, they don't, and they're quoting these like Chinese Exclusion Act cases that are just so explicitly racist. And so a lot of the foundations of immigration law really are on this racist foundation.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think they're not just immigration enforcement, they don't just intersect with racialization and ideas of whiteness, but they are completely historically entangled with them. So the comment that I wanted to make also is that I'm very concerned about the sort of whole media and online ecology, and that goes back to the question about youth from the previous, from the Q&A after Senator Kuhn's talk, that we have, you know, young people, they don't read the regular news that the rest of us mortals do, but they get all their information from all of these online sources. And so we have a real problem with all the kind of white supremacist ideas circulating that are often, I mean, they're masked to some extent, but they're also more bold than ever. And we're sort of becoming, I don't want to say more numb, but they're becoming more normalized and more sort of readily available in the public space in ways that they were not before. And this also gives, and they're backed by billionaires, right? All the people who own all these platforms and don't want to regulate them. And that I see, you know, the whole question of shifting ideas of whiteness and culture wars, that is a real concern. And it is up to all of us of, you know, addressing and dealing with all of those members of society who feel interpolated by these ideas because they feel like outcasts, they feel like they don't have anywhere to go, and we can find it appalling in all sorts of ways, but it's also our problem.
Right. So. I think that's great answers, and maybe one other quick question in addition to the racialization problem. How much of the spectacle of detention, arrests, and the violence around immigration is really an attempt to deflect attention from failed policies, failed, you know, housing shortages, food shortages, and food insecurity, job loss, job insecurity. We have a host of social problems, and how much, in your view, is an attempt to deflect attention from this?
Well, but I think all of it is. I
Yeah.
mean, it's, that's why, I mean, it provides a scapegoat. It provides an excuse for what we can't do because we, quote, have to take care of these people.
Right.
But it also sets people up to diminish these individuals. And I think the reason that, or one part of what we're trying to engage in here with people is to pay attention, all of us, to our language. Because this language is out and about all of the time. The president says only over and over again he's only deporting criminals.
Right.
That's totally invented. He just made that up.
Right.
But there was early on, in one of the shelters in Times Square, I think it's about 18 months ago, there was some fracas and some teenage person from an immigrant family had his hands on a gun and shot the gun, didn't shoot anybody, but he shot it in the air. The first response, press conference by the city of New York was, this is not an immigrant crime wave. So what words do you think were in everybody's mind from then on?
Right.
This immigrant crime wave.
Right.
I mean, and it deflects from everything else and it makes people think those.
Right. It's incredible. Anybody else? Any other comments? I wanted to take some questions from the audience. Is somebody working the microphones here?
Like Gordon is.
Yeah.
Go ahead. We can hear you. Just talk loud.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I want to address an issue that Ruth Messinger raised briefly, and that has to do with the economic consequences of what's going on. And Ruth, you're absolutely correct the kind of jobs that they hold, and ultimately, they are currently paying Social Security taxes, and they are providing important services, not just in our city, but in rural communities. They're responsible for harvests and so on. But let's turn our attention, at least for a moment or two, to the other immigrants who come to the United States. And I hate to use the language because of the worst, really give me a break. But the best of the best aren't coming in the same extent that they were previously. Again, if you look at today's New York Times, you'll see that there's been a decline of 17% in foreign students coming to the United States. Let me give you some other data to think about. 2/3 of the working PhDs in the United States in categories like applied engineering, technology, and medicine, 2/3 of them are immigrants. Not children of immigrants, and we are discouraging them from coming here. Just think about some of the visa discussions that we've had over the last month or so. We're going to charge these people $100,000 to come to the United States per person per annum. It affects our supply of doctors, our supply of nurses, and of course, a lot of this is also reflected in the war on science. So you have had a wonderful conversation about what is happening to people who are not yet in the categories that we would like them to be in terms of economics, in terms of schooling and so on. But the people that we have been able to attract to this country over the last many generations, people who are well-educated, people who are scientists, people who are intellectual leaders, they are not coming either. And this is an enormous economic problem for us, not just now, but more importantly in the future.
So you have some more questions?
other
And at the end, I'd like to say something tomorrow, but at the end, go ahead.
Thank you. You talked about so many of previous laws that were evil or wrong. Is there any value in advocacy for repealing these previous laws that are now being used for all this cruelty?
I mean, I think one of the most, what happened with the big, beautiful bill, or the big funding bill that was passed, like, shortly after Trump took office, I think just repealing that is a good start because, I think one of the most effective ways of really changing things is through the budgets. And so, they have to fund detention centers, they have to fund this enforcement. And so if there's some way to get at that funding, because it's so scary because they haven't even really been able to do what they can with the money they have. And so I think what we're going to see in the next couple years is just so frightening. And it's going to be just so outrageous because they just haven't been able to hire quick enough, build enough detention centers quick enough with all this vast amounts of money they have. So I feel like in a, both like abolitionist perspective and something that is reasonable, because if we're having, if people can't get SNAP, if all these things are being taken away from people and yet just throwing vast amounts of money at these enforcement just to perpetuate this cruelty, I think that's like a very, very important place to start.
Yeah, no, I would agree if I can just chime in on that as well. I think, I'm not well versed in like the actual legal possibilities of repealing the laws, but I do think that the funding, as Kyle just mentioned, is absolutely crucial. Including to your past question. So one thing is like the spectacle of detention and deportation and kind of showing that the government has a strong man and we're sending people back, or they are sending people back. But the other aspect of it is also that the real goal is to round up and detain and keep people in detention for as long as possible, without the possibility of getting out on bond. there's no immigration bonds to be had these days, and that is because it's so unbelievably profitable for a whole host of industries, and probably also the Trump family themselves, who one would imagine have stocks in many of these companies. So I agree that the funding and taking out or de-incentivizing the profit motive is absolutely key here.
Wonderful. And maybe one last question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a pulpit rabbi in Harrisburg, and something that I notice in talking about immigration and these kinds of issues is that there's a lot of fear in the Jewish community about anti-Semitism right now, and some of these policies, like you named, about prosecuting students for freedom of speech, have been sort of done in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, and so there's like a sense of needing to sort of protect our own, and I'm wondering like how we can break past that. I think it's true not only in the Jewish community, but there's fear in a lot of realms right now where communities are kind of like hunkering down to protect themselves on economic levels or because of like racial issues, et cetera. So how do you kind of break past that to get people who aren't like, whose families aren't immediately affected to care about these things?
Great question.
The only way that I know to do it, which I mentioned briefly and can't say it works, is to, and I'm going to talk about this at the workshop this afternoon, is to get people to tell their stories and to tell their stories to their families. We're very good at not doing this. There are plenty of, when I do what I did before, which is in an audience asking people to tell their histories, when I do it in a congregation, I promise you that there will always be one person who will put up his or her hand and say, it was different when my family came. They can't possibly give me evidence that it was different when their families came. As soon as but that's the process of othering that we were all describing. That is intentional. So you give people reasons to fear immigrants. Anti-Semitism is used as a weapon. So is taking your job. So is being overrun by people of color. There's 1,000 stories offered, and we can only counter that with what is basically the truth, which is, first of all, we have a fierce moral obligation, and second of all, we have a great economic benefit for helping immigrants move into our cities and our country because they continue to play the kind of role that we need people to play. People regularly tell me that they don't know any immigrants, and sorry for the reference here, but I ask people, do you ever have food delivered at home from a restaurant? Everyone delivering food in a restaurant in this city right now is an undocumented immigrant sharing an e-bike and a DoorDash menu because it's a way to make money. So you're meeting immigrants all the time. Your economy, the economy of the city depends on people like this. So I'm going to take the liberty of reading, I have 2 paragraphs and I'm not going to read them. I'm going to read 1 sentence from the 2 paragraphs, but it's important to me to read it to this audience. You will note from the language that it's when people used to speak with more grace. America has established for itself a tradition of open-handed generosity in its response to appeals for help that come from beyond its borders. The respect for human rights, the understanding of the dignity of the individual, the reverence for personality, which are part of the American way of looking at life, carry with them a deep sympathy with those who suffer from the brutality of tyrants. That was written and delivered by my grandfather on WNBC radio on behalf of the JDC in April of 1939.
I would just add to the question about particular communities hunkering down to protect themselves, is that within those communities, I also imagine that there are people who are more inclined to reach out beyond, right? And that is a place to start, that relationships, that getting to know immigrant neighbors, that figuring out who in any given community is concerned, does want to check in with other folks, does want to explore what it might be like to be in deeper relationship. those are, and it's easier to potentially say that in a smaller community because you know the people, and those people perhaps know other people. And that's where some of this work at the ground level has to begin, because that's about building the kind of world that we actually want to live in. That's the moral imaginary. That's the imagining what would it be like if I were living in this community and I weren't afraid, and everyone had what they needed, or that we had a system by which I could share my food more easily with someone who doesn't have food, because the folks that I encounter often are asking that question. It feels difficult sometimes to reach out and find ways to provide support and connection, but they're there, right? And we need people to do that on a human-to-human scale.
Do you want to say anything? I just wanted to add that, keep in mind that these anti-immigration policies stoke a lot of anxiety between groups. And when it comes to anti-Semitism, though it's real, I don't think it's I don't think this is the anti-Semitism that a government that's also promoting white nationalism, that we want to feel comfortable with that framing of anti-Semitism. So that's important to keep in mind. And I think with that, I think we're going to end the panel. Thank you. We're running out.
Thank you so much. As your program indicates, this is lunchtime. So there was lunch